This story happened a few years ago when I was still living on a farm in the countryside. My stepmother had always dreamed of living in a place where she could grow her own food and raise a variety of animals. After many searches and failed attempts, we finally found a house that seemed perfect. It was located on an asparagus farm, surrounded by green fields and a dense forest in the distance. As soon as we moved in, we brought chickens, ducks, and rabbits, eager to start this new life. The chickens and ducks roamed freely around the property, enjoying their space and looking incredibly happy. Harmony seemed to reign, and everything was going very well. However, this did not last long. Shortly after a brood of ducklings was born, two of our adult ducks simply disappeared. It was strange, because we found no trace, no feathers scattered on the ground, no signs of a fight having taken place. They had vanished as if they had evaporated into thin air. We thought that perhaps the ducks had ventured to the creek at the back of the property, but it still didn't make sense. Doubt hung in the air, and the feeling that something was wrong began to bother us. One night, a storm began to form on the horizon. The wind began to blow hard, and soon the first drops of rain fell. My stepmother and I ran to make sure that all the animals were safe in their shelters. It was at that moment that we heard a strange sound coming from the forest. It was the quacking of a duck, and we immediately thought that perhaps it was our lost ducks. Without thinking twice, we ran towards the forest to investigate. My father and brother, always ready for any eventuality, grabbed their guns and came after us. When we reached the edge of the creek, they asked me to stay alert and whistle if I saw anything suspicious. As I walked through the land near the old barn, I noticed that the forest was plunged into an eerie silence. Not a sound of crickets, not a rustle of leaves. There was only a heavy darkness and the feeling that something was watching us. When I finally returned to the meeting point, I saw my stepmother coming out of the woods with a worried expression on her face. Suddenly, we heard a whistle coming from inside the forest, right in front of us. We thought it was my brother, but when he and my father appeared on the other side, they asked why we were whistling. That was when it dawned on us. Neither of us had whistled. The sound was coming from a place where no one was, just the eerie echo repeating between the trees. This event left us apprehensive, but the worst was yet to come. About a week later, another inexplicable thing happened. I wasn't there, but my brother and sister were in the backyard around 8 o'clock that night when they saw something unusual. At the back of the yard, near the line that separated our property from the forest, they saw a man crouched down. He was dressed completely in white, standing in a strange position. My brother, frightened, grabbed a gun and fired into the air, shouting at the man to leave. The figure, without hesitation, ran into the forest. Later, my sister revealed that she had seen the same man before, hiding behind a fence post. She said she had not told anyone, but that on that occasion he had a strange glow around his body, something that made her uneasy. Since then, we have never known whether the strange whistling we heard in the forest and the appearance of the man dressed in white were connected. But after these events, our parents became much more cautious and forbade any of us from going into the forest alone. The feeling that something unknown was prowling our property never left us. About 5 years ago, when I was 26, I decided I wanted to travel the world. I had just finished college and was in debt and couldn't find a job, even for which I was highly qualified. I felt sad and alone in my small town in Washington, so I decided to do something different. Travel. A friend from school suggested I try woofing. You work about 25 hours a week on a farm, and in return, you get food and a place to stay. The cool thing is that there are a lot of people doing it, so you can easily make new friends, meet people from all over the world, and get out of your routine while exploring new countries. After 8 months, I was practically an expert at cleaning up cow poop. I started in Washington, went to Oregon, and then made it to California. There, I managed to save some money by doing odd jobs, and soon I had the chance to buy a ticket to anywhere in the world. It was an incredible feeling. I followed the advice of a volunteer friend and chose a random destination. I went to a website, clicked on a country, and Georgia. I knew very little about this place, but that only made it more exciting. I bought my ticket and started looking for a farm to stay at. It wasn't easy to find many options, and the farms I found were quite isolated, with no internet or anything. But one of them responded. It was on top of a mountain and looked amazing in the photos. A stone house, a big garden, animals, and a smiling family. I was excited and set off. When I arrived in the capital, Tbilisi, I followed the directions I was given. The problem was that almost no one spoke English, and the roads were old and full of potholes. After 20 hours of traveling in very old buses and taxis, I finally arrived at the farm. The way was a dirt road, and when I saw the house, it looked very different from the photos. It was dark, with dry plants around it and a kind of abandoned air. Even so, I kept going. The person who greeted me was a man named Giri, not his real name. He was short, a little overweight, and always had a smile on his face. He greeted me with a handshake and began to show me around, speaking in broken English. The house was in terrible shape. The roof of the barn had fallen in, the crops were dying, and the whole place smelled of mold. Despite all this, I was too tired to worry, so I accepted the meal he offered me and went to bed. In the early hours of the morning, I was woken up by a strange noise, like something metal being dragged across the wooden floor. I was so sleepy that after a few minutes the noise stopped and I went back to sleep. The next day, Giri asked me to fix some things in the house, saying he would go to a nearby village to get parts. While he was away, I started exploring the house and quickly realized something was wrong. The photos on the online listing didn't look like this place, and Giri wasn't even in the pictures. Everything there looked abandoned, with broken furniture and old papers scattered around. That's when I got really scared. I packed my things and was about to leave when I saw 3 men coming up the hill. In fear, I ran to the back of the house and down into the woods, trying to hide. They came into the house and started looking for me. I stayed quietly behind a bush, trying not to make any noise. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard their footsteps walking away. I waited a little longer, and when I felt safe, I got back on the path and ran out of there as fast as I could. Eventually, I reached a paved road, and luckily, a very friendly family gave me a ride back to town. The farm disappeared from the website a few days later, and I never heard from Giri again. Some people think he and his friends just want to chat, but my gut told me that something very strange was going on there. When I was a child, I lived with my aunt, uncle, and older brothers in a very isolated house in the middle of nowhere. Our house was surrounded by a huge pasture, and there was nothing else around, except for an old, abandoned cabin that sat at the very back of the property. This cabin had always been there, half forgotten, and no one in our family cared much for it. My uncle, who loved to tell stories, would often talk about the past of our land, about the people who lived there long before us. He had a special way of making the stories seem real, and sometimes even a little scary. One day, as we were sitting around the campfire, he told me a story that gave me chills. He told me about the old cabin, which used to belong to a farmer and his little daughter. The farmer worked hard to run the farm by himself, and his little daughter, who was about 6 years old, was a happy child with fair skin and long, dark hair. She was always around, playing while her father worked. The uncle told me that one day, while the farmer was harvesting his crops with a tractor, a tragedy happened. The little girl was playing too close to the work area, and her father, without realizing it, only saw her when it was too late. He tried to shout for her to move away, but there was no time. It was a horrible accident, and the little girl lost her life in a very sad way. I was very young when I first heard the story, and it scared me so much that I could hardly sleep for the next few nights. The idea of something so terrible happening in that cabin gave me chills. But over time, I tried to forget the story, although it always remained in the back of my mind, especially when I looked at the cabin in the middle of the pasture. My brother Robert, who was older than me, was the kind of person who was not scared of anything. He was strong, fearless, and never showed fear. So one weekend, he decided to do something that no one in the family had tried before. He and his friends decided to camp in the abandoned cabin. They thought it would be fun, and maybe even a little adventure. They spent the day fixing the broken parts of the cabin and getting everything ready for the night. None of them knew the story that Uncle had told me, and I didn't want to spoil their fun by telling them what I knew. When it started to get dark, Robert and his friends went to the cabin, taking flashlights and sleeping bags. They laughed, talked, and did everything that boys do when they're together. But what happened next was something we never expected. In the middle of the night, Robert, who was lying in one of the old beds, woke up to a strange sound. It was like someone crying outside in the middle of the pasture. He tried to ignore it, thinking that maybe it was just the nocturnal animals. But the sound of crying grew louder, and soon he heard a faint scream, coming from somewhere in the distance. Robert's heart began to beat faster. He felt as if something was watching him. He tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. He then sat up in bed, and the moment he looked at the foot of the bed, he saw something that made him freeze. There was a little girl there with long, dark hair, but her body was covered in cuts and scratches. She was crying softly, the kind of crying that makes your throat tighten because she looked like she was in so much pain and despair. Robert was so terrified that he could barely move. The girl was still there, crying, and he didn't know what to do. Suddenly, he jumped out of bed and ran out of the cabin, yelling for his friends to come out too. They all ran, frantic, across the pasture towards our house. They arrived there sweating, panting, and completely scared. Robert was crying, something I had never seen before. He tried to tell what had happened, but he was so shaken he could barely speak. My aunt and uncle woke up to the commotion, and my aunt tried to calm my brother, but he was still shaking with fear. The next morning, when things had calmed down a bit, I finally told Robert about the story my uncle had told me about the farmer and his daughter. When he heard it, he turned pale. Somehow, it seemed like the story made sense now. He had seen the little girl, the same one my uncle had described, and that had scared him even more. A few months later, something unexpected happened. The old cabin caught fire. No one knew how the fire started, but the cabin was completely destroyed. My uncle said that perhaps the little girl could finally rest in peace now that the cabin, the place where she had suffered, was no more. Even after many years, this story is still told in our family. Whenever we think of it, it sends a shiver down our spine.